Hello, we are in Unit 7, American Revolution, The Road to Independence. Today we'll be looking at Chapter 2, the Part 1. So I want to review a little bit before we get started. I want to remind you that the British government, way over in England, away from the colonies, imposed taxes on the colonists so that they could repay their debt from war and pay soldiers to protect the colonies. One of those taxes was called the Stamp Act, which was a tax on paper. Anything the colonists bought that was made of paper, they had to pay an additional tax on. And the colonists were not happy about it. However, they were peaceful in their protest until now. Let's see what happened. In your reader, please turn to page 10. And the big question for this chapter:
who were the Sons of Liberty, and what form of protest did they lead in Boston Harbor?
Okay. First thing I want to look at is the title of this chapter.
Trouble is brewing.
Now, I want to look at that term brewing. The term brewing is used to describe a method of preparing coffee and tea. So you brew tea. When I want a cup of tea, I put a tea bag in some water, and the water and the tea leaves mix together. That's called brewing. The term may also be used as a metaphor to mean preparations are underway. For example, something is developing. So in this case, do you think we're going to be talking about making a cup of tea? Or does the title mean that something is developing? And in this case, trouble is developing.
Yeah, I do.
Which one?
I think trouble is going to happen.
All right, so let's see if your prediction is true. Here we go. First paragraph. Some of the most passionate protests against the Stamp Act took place in Boston, Massachusetts. There, angry crowds took their frustration out on tax collectors. A new group of protesters formed in Boston in response to the Stamp Act. The group met under a tree that they called the Liberty Tree. They made public speeches against taxes and the British government. They cried, "No taxation without representation." This group became known as the Sons of Liberty. Eventually, after much protest, the British government decided to repeal the Stamp Act. Repeal means they took it back. In 1766, Parliament eliminated the tax on paper products. That means they took it away. But in 1767, it replaced it with other taxes, including taxes on imported goods such as tea. The taxes were officially known as the Townshend Acts. So let's review that a little bit. So the British government finally decided to say, okay, we're going to get rid of the Stamp Act. However, when they got rid of it, they didn't just let all of the taxes go away. They made new taxes. And these new taxes were on imported goods. Friends, when you import something, it means you take it into your country. So in this case, tea was coming from outside of the colonies. It was coming from another country, probably across the ocean. So because it was coming into our country, it was imported. Okay, so a couple of questions. Here we go. So, the Sons of Liberty led the cry, "No taxation without representation." What does the phrase "no taxation without representation" mean?
The colonists had no representatives to stand up for them in the British Parliament, where the decision to tax the colonists was made. They felt this was unfair and wanted a voice in making decisions that affected them.
Okay, and who were the Sons of Liberty? And we're going to find that information in paragraph 2. So take a look at paragraph 2, and my special guest is going to help us define who the Sons of Liberty were.
A new group of protesters.
All right, so they were a group of protesters.
They made public speeches.
Who made public speeches.
And against taxes and the British Parliament, they cried, "No taxation without representation."
And so what does the last sentence say?
No This group became known as the Sons of Liberty.
Sons of Liberty. They were a group of protesters who made public speeches and said no taxation without representation. That means they didn't want taxes unless they had a say in it. Okay? Next page, page 11. Let's take a look at the image on the top. What is that image?
A teapot.
Okay? And what is on that?
It says Stamp Act repealed.
So that's a teapot celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act. Interesting. Let's read on. Tea was a popular drink in the colonies, just as it was in Great Britain. However, many people decided they would not buy British tea if they had to pay an unfair tax. And they thought the new tax on tea was every bit as unfair as the old tax on paper. After all, the new tax had been approved by the same British Parliament in London, and there was still no representatives from the 13 colonies. Suddenly, deciding to take a sip of tea meant something more than just having a drink. If you bought British tea, you were paying a tax, and indirectly, you were agreeing that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. On the other hand, if you refused to buy British tea, you were making a statement of a different kind. You were saying that you did not approve of and would not accept taxation without representation. All over a cup of tea. If you drank it, you were saying, okay, they can give us a tax. If you refused, you were saying, no way. No taxation without representation. All over a cup of tea. Last paragraph. Colonists who were hungry about, let's try that again. They weren't hungry. Colonists who were angry about the war. Boy, I'm really not doing well. Here we go. Colonists who were angry about the new tax agreed not to buy British tea. But they didn't stop there. Hint, hint, hint. They also visited inns and other places that sold tea and asked the owners to stop selling it. Many establishments, that means businesses, agreed to boycott British tea. So those businesses agreed to not sell the British tea. So my question, why didn't the British government's repeal of the Stamp Act change the way colonists felt?
The British government repealed the Stamp Act, but imposed a new tax in its place. The new tax had been approved without colonial representation in Parliament, just as with the Stamp Act. Again, the colonists had to pay a tax they thought was unfair.
Yeah. All right, let's turn to page 12. Let's see if this keeps going. Debates and protests about the British government's role in colonial affairs continued, especially in Boston. In 1768, in response to the protests about the new taxes, the British government sent soldiers to Boston to keep an eye on the Sons of Liberty. Because the British soldiers wore red uniforms, the colonists sometimes referred to them as redcoats or lobsterbacks. In March 1770, several Bostonians got into a tussle with a redcoat. The Bostonians surrounded the soldier and called him names. They threw snowballs at him, and some members of the crowd even threatened him with sticks and clubs. More British soldiers arrived on the scene. They ordered the Bostonians to go home, but the angry protesters refused. The situation became more serious when even more people poured into the streets. Soon, a crowd of 300 angry Bostonians was pressing in on the outnumbered British soldiers. Some of the Bostonians shouted at the soldiers, daring them to fire their guns. One of the Bostonians threw something at the soldiers. It may have been a snowball. It may have been a rock. Whatever it was, it hit one of the soldiers and knocked him down. Perhaps thinking his life was in danger, the soldier fired his musket. One of the Bostonians fought back, attacking the soldier with a club. After that, the other British soldiers responded. They fired into the crowd. When it was over, 5 people were dead. The Sons of Liberty were outraged. They began making speeches about the incident, which became known as the Boston Massacre. They insisted that the Bostonians had been protesting peacefully, which they had been.
Yeah.
You know, they were writing letters, giving speeches, and the British had no reason to fire on them. That was their perspective. That's what they thought. One of the Sons of Liberty, a man named Paul Revere, created an engraving that showed British soldiers firing into a crowd of peaceful protesters. It was not an entirely accurate picture of what had happened, but many colonists thought that it was. And the image at the bottom of your page is Paul Revere's engraving of the event that became known as the Boston Massacre. Do you think the British soldiers had good reason to fire on the Bostonians?
Answers may vary. Yes, because the British were outnumbered and they were provoked by the angry crowd's actions.
Shouting, taunting, throwing things, and hitting one of the soldiers.
Or no, because the Bostonians were unarmed and unable to defend themselves. So
Okay.
It wasn't really fair.
So you could think of it either way. So let's describe the incident that became known as the Boston Massacre.
British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of protesters in the streets of Boston.
Okay. Now let's talk about that word massacre. That word massacre has a synonym, the word murder. And it is often used when innocent and unarmed people are killed. So that's when you would use the word massacre. So friends, thanks for hanging out with me today. We'll see you next time.